today in Wisconsin?
We ought to have a recall process. I don't think it ought to be stricken from our statutes. People ought to have the option to recall legislators. That said, I think the current recall law, which essentially has no restrictions whatsoever in terms of the reason for initiating a recall, you can do it if you don't like a guy wearing brown shoes rather than black shoes, really, if you want to, needs to be modified, because I think you're correct that while obtaining a quarter of the signatures of those who voted for governor in the last election is a difficult obstacle to initiating a recall, to have no restriction at all on the reason for the recall it just leads to what will become, I'm afraid, and I think many voters are afraid, are nonstop recalls. And I don't think the voters of the state want that to become the new normal in Wisconsin politics, where somebody serves a year and for any reason on any vote that they might have taken, boom, you can initiate a recall. Because again, while the signature requirement is an obstacle, you've seen that it wasn't too hard in 9 districts around the state to get those signatures, and that's especially true when there are no restrictions on bringing in circulators from out of state and paying them to do the job. I mean, if you pay somebody, 25 cents a signature or whatever was paid to those individuals, that's a pretty damn good incentive to go around an area and get signatures on a recall petition, and that's how over 8,000 of them were gathered in my race. Nothing wrong with it because it's state law. I'm just saying it sure makes it easier to get to that scenario where it's constant recalls in the state. So I think the state law ought to be reviewed. I don't have a preference for how the law ought to be changed. I think a blue ribbon task force or governor's recall commission ought to sit down and look at our law, look at our experience in the state, and decide based on input from people whether it's time for a dramatic rewrite of recall law in the state of Wisconsin. But I think that process ought to start. I think voters do want to have that discussion in the state.
Okay.
Well, it's a tough time politically in the state of Wisconsin, and there is more divisiveness. You mentioned union money supporting my campaign. You forgot to mention corporate money supporting the other side of the campaign. And I think it's kind of two questions. One is, how do we get to more comity or togetherness and moderation in the state capitol? How does the legislature come together and work with the governor, and how do politicians work together? And then the other side of the question is, what about these campaigns? How do politicians ever come together if these campaigns are so destructive? And addressing the campaign issue first, one thing I think we need to do is do some campaign finance reform. You're seeing two kinds of ads in this campaign, in this recall campaign, as you do in every campaign. One of the issue ads, and the issue ads, of course, are those when the announcer instructs you to call a number and complain to whoever answers the phone about the person who's the target of the ad. And those issue ads, there's absolutely no restrictions on running them, paying for them. You'll never know who pays for those ads or where the money comes from. You'll never know how much money is spent on those ads unless you call the TV station. But there's absolutely no reporting requirements or requirement to reveal the source of the funding for those issue ads. And so you're seeing lots of them, and you'll see in this district probably pretty close to $1 million spent on issue ads by outside antagonists on both sides of the question. You're never going to know where this money comes from or any other information about the source of the ad. The other kind of advertisement is ads run by the candidate and ads run by political groups who have to report in Wisconsin because they advocate for or against the candidate. They don't just say call this number and talk about. They actually say vote against holperin or vote against Simic. And we have pretty good accounting of the money behind those ads, who runs them, where the money comes from, and that system is pretty well regulated in Wisconsin. So I think we have to get after the issue ads in Wisconsin to the degree that is constitutionally allowed, and that will help control, at least a little bit, at least in my view, some of the contentiousness and dirt, mud, if you will, that you see in these elections. So